Founded in 1865, Cargill is one of the largest companies on Earth. But not a single share has ever traded, and not one ever will. The family sealed it shut more than a century ago, deliberately, and never reversed it. While Wall Street made going public the American dream, they built the opposite. A company no outsider could buy, price, or see inside. The people who control it are worth tens of billions. None appear on any rich list, yet the fortune is there, and no outsider is allowed to count it. Conover, Iowa, 1865. A man named William Wallace Cargill takes over a single grain warehouse near the end of the Civil War and starts storing other people's wheat for a fee. Nothing in that picture says Dynasty. It says small-town merchant with a ledger and a decent spot by the railroad. But the thing that turned a grain shed into one of the most private fortunes on Earth has almost nothing to do with grain. It comes down to a single choice about ownership, and most companies never even get to make it.
A company that sells its shares to the public takes on a kind of master. It has to open its books, publish a fresh number every 3 months, and keep happy the sort of owner who buys in on Monday and is gone by Friday. The instant those shares start trading, the market hangs a price tag on the whole thing, and that price gets written down, ranked, and lined up against everyone else's. A private company carries none of that weight. Its books stay shut, no quarterly number goes out, and the only people it answers to are the ones who already own it. With no public price, there is no figure for anyone to drop into a ranking. The fortune can be staggering, and still leave no footprint a magazine is able to measure. Which is why the real disappearing trick the oldest money uses is not a number to count in Geneva or a name buried in some shell company. It is slower than that and much harder to copy. They keep the whole thing private, and they never sell a piece of it to strangers. That one decision is the entire act. Everything after this is 4 families in 4 countries, proving across 160 years that it holds.
Back in Iowa, that grain shed kept growing. By the early 1900s, the Cargills and the Macmillans had built it into a machine, moving a serious share of the grain crossing American borders. The obvious next step, the one every banker in the room kept pushing, was to take it public. A stock listing would have minted instant billionaires and handed the family more cash than they could spend in a lifetime. They said no. They have gone on saying no for more than 100 years. Today, Cargill pulls in more than $150 billion a year, enough to sit near the very top of the corporate world if it were listed anywhere at all. But it never has been. Roughly 100 descendants of the founders still own close to 90% of it, which quietly makes them the 4th wealthiest family in America. But the pull to cash out never really fades once the numbers get that big. So the family did something smarter than simply refusing. In 1993, they built a way for relatives to sell shares back into the company itself. And in 2011, they handed shareholders a piece of a fertilizer business called Mosaic that could be traded out on the open market. The family pulled cash out whenever it wanted, while outsiders still got no way in. It was a way to sell without ever going public, which is a sentence that should not work and somehow does. They guarded this hard for something colder than sentiment about the founder. A private company can take a loss for a year or a whole decade without one analyst demanding a turnaround by Friday. It can buy a rival or sit out a boom on nothing but the family's own judgment. Going public would have made 100 relatives rich on paper and handed every one of those decisions to strangers who think in 3-month windows. The family decided the control was worth more than the cash, and they were never seriously tempted to test that math. But one family pushed this further than Cargill ever did and turned plain privacy into something close to a vow of silence. Mars was founded in 1911 by a candy maker named Frank Mars, and almost everyone alive has eaten its products without once hearing the family's name. Snickers, M&Ms, Milky Way, Twix. Underneath the candy sits a pet empire that now earns even more than the sweets, with Pedigree, Whiskas, Royal Canin, and a chain of veterinary hospitals behind it. Last year, the company sold around $54 billion worth of all of it. Not one public share has ever changed hands. When Mars wanted the chewing gum giant Wrigley in 2008, it put up around $23 billion, with Warren Buffett as a financing partner rather than tap the stock market, a measure of how far the family will go to stay off the exchange. The man who set the family's temperature was Frank's son, Forrest Mars Sr., and his rule was close to absolute. In 1966, he gave a single rare interview to a trade magazine called Candy Industry, decided he had been misquoted, and never really spoke to the press again for the rest of his life. He raised his children to distrust outsiders, to keep every number inside the family, and to assume that anyone asking questions was after something. To this day, the head office sits behind a plain sign in McLean, Virginia, wrapped in the kind of security more suited to an intelligence agency than a maker of chocolate bars. Which means the family's true wealth is a guess, even for the people who do this for a living. The estimates land somewhere between $120 and $140 billion, which would seat the Marses among the richest families on the planet. The honest answer is that nobody outside the family actually knows, because there is no share price to multiply and no filing to open. And Forrest Sr. did not build all of this from a desk in America. He spent years in Europe learning the trade and assembling the company's foreign arm. And that thread is what carries this story across the Atlantic. Because the same instinct, stay private, answer to no one, was already a whole way of life for a family most people have never managed to name. In 1841, two brothers named Clemens and August Brenninkmeijer opened a cloth shop in the Dutch town of Sneek. They named it after their two initials, C and A, and half of Europe has wandered through one of their stores without a second thought. But the family behind it has spent nearly 2 centuries being almost impossible to see. They have never listed on any exchange. They have never, as a family, sat for a press interview. Their holding company hides in a forgettable office park in Zug, Switzerland, and the whole thing has been called, fairly, the closest thing Europe has to an invisible dynasty. The family traces back to traveling linen sellers who left a German farm in the 1600s, and the silence was practical long before it hardened into tradition. Quiet kept rivals from copying their prices, and it kept the customs men from knowing exactly what was crossing the border. In this family, the privacy stops looking like shyness and starts looking like engineering, because it is written straight into the rules of ownership. The shares cannot be inherited, and they cannot be sold. A family member earns the right to buy a stake only by climbing into one of the top jobs, and at 65, he hands that stake back at its current value for the next generation to earn the same way. Around 500 relatives share in the wider fortune, but the real owners number fewer than 100 at any moment, and every one of them had to work their way in. Estimates put the family's assets near $35 billion, spread across the C and A stores, a large property arm, and a private equity business. None of it carries a ticker symbol. That structure let the fortune do something most fortunes cannot. It walked straight through the worst of the 20th century, through 2 wars and the occupation of the very countries it grew up in, without ever being a tidy, countable, public target. Shares cannot be seized on an exchange that never lists them in the first place. And if all of that sounds like the cautious habit of shopkeepers, the family that perfected it was anything but. The Rothschilds built the template everyone else has been copying ever since. 2 centuries ago, Mayer Amschel Rothschild placed his 5 sons in 5 European capitals, Frankfurt, Vienna, London, Naples, and Paris, and bound them with a family pact to keep the bank's capital strictly among themselves. Outsiders borrowed from them to fund wars and railways, but no outsider was ever allowed to buy a slice of the family itself. Their crest shows a closed fist gripping 5 arrows, one for each son, beneath a single word, Concordia, meaning unity. The structure was the entire point. For most of 2 centuries that held without exception. But for a stretch, even the Rothschilds tested the other road. Their banking group ended up listed in Paris, its shares trading in public under the name Rothschild and Company, with the family holding a controlling block, but no longer the whole. And what they did next is the real tell. In 2023, they bought it all back. The family holding company, Concordia, named for that same 200-year-old motto, tendered for every share it did not already own and pulled the firm off the Paris exchange completely, in a deal that valued it at around 3.7 billion euros. Their reason was almost blunt. A business like theirs, they said, is better judged over decades than every 90 days, and private ownership suited it better than a public listing ever had.
So the family that wrote the original rulebook on staying private had drifted toward the public market, studied it up close, and deliberately backed out. The privacy was never a side effect of how these fortunes got built. It was the method itself, the reason every one of them is so hard to count today. Which leaves one obvious question. What happens to a great fortune when a family does the exact opposite and lets its ownership trade in the open? For about a century, one American family owned the most respected financial newspaper in the country. The Bancrofts controlled Dow Jones, the company behind the Wall Street Journal, and on paper, their grip looked unbreakable. They held a special class of stock that handed them roughly 68% of the voting power, while owning a much smaller share of the actual business. By the logic of every family in this story, that should have been more than enough.
But the Bancrofts had done the one thing Cargill, Mars, and the Brenninkmeiers all refused to do. Their company was public. The shares traded every single day, and every single day, the market stamped a price on them. So in 2007, when Rupert Murdoch offered $60 a share, a 67% premium worth more than $5 billion, the family's control turned out to be made of paper. The special votes counted for nothing once enough relatives looked at the number and wanted the cash. For years, the family creed had been 3 words: never sell Grandpa's paper. But by 2007, it had quietly become a slogan almost nobody still believed. They sold, and 100 years of control ended in a matter of weeks.
And the prize itself did not even hold its price. Within about 14 months, Murdoch's company had written down the value of what it bought by nearly $3 billion. The fortune the Bancrofts spent a century guarding was, in the end, priced, sold, and marked down almost the moment it left their hands. Held up against all of this, the famous rich lists start to look like what they really are. They are a measure of visible wealth and nothing more. The families who took their companies public can be counted to the last dollar every day by anyone holding a phone. The families who never did are simply absent, not because the money is smaller, but because there is no public number to write down. Cargill on its own, if it ever listed, could rearrange the top of those rankings overnight. It will not, so it never shows up at all. What those lists actually rank is how visible a fortune is willing to be. The pattern repeats in 3 countries and across 160 years, which is the only test this channel uses before calling something a rule instead of a coincidence. A grain trader in Iowa, a candy family in Virginia, a clothing dynasty run out of Switzerland, and the oldest bank in Europe all landed on the same instinct without ever needing to compare notes. Keep it whole, keep it private, and never let a stranger put a price on it. And that closes a story told across 3 films. The first was about owning nothing on paper while quietly controlling everything underneath. The second was about cutting a single fortune into so many pieces that no one on the outside could ever add them back up. This one is the plainest of the 3, and maybe the most demanding. Own the whole thing outright and never sell a share of it to the outside world. 3 separate methods, 1 shared aim, which is to hold a vast amount of wealth and leave almost no number behind for anyone to find. Cargill is still sitting in the middle of the world's food supply, still held by the same families, still impossible to price from the outside.
The fortune is there. The world is simply not allowed to count it. Subscribe. Wealth Cipher takes apart the machinery the richest families use to move, hide, and hold their capital while everyone else is busy watching the wrong numbers. The cipher has always existed. Now you know where to look.